topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Alise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Great to have you. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez, joining you live from Dallas, which is my home base. If we've not met you yet and you don't know me, I'm a management consultant, organizational logotherapist, speaker, and author. My team and I at Alise Cortez and Associates help companies to enliven their operations by articulating their purpose and building inspirational leaders and cultures activated by meaning and purpose to turn those companies from a flatline EKG to a vibrant workplace. There, people are intrinsically motivated to perform at their best, grow into their fuller potential, and are committed to stay and help deliver on the company's mission. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at alisecortez.com. Getting into today's program, with us today is Frank Devine. He's the founder of Accelerated Improvement, which specializes in creating a high-performance and continuous improvement culture from the bottom up. He's the author of Rapid Mass Engagement, Driving Continuous Improvement Through Employees Culture Creation, which is what we're talking about today. Frank lives in England, though he's actually joining us today from Ireland, where he's visiting clients. It's quite late there. So, Frank, welcome to Working on Purpose and staying up for us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So great to have you. I really, as you may know, in our exchanges, I love hosting the show. I've been doing it for 8 years. And I largely bring on authors like you who can really advance the conversations on creating those workplaces that we want to work in and we can thrive in. So I absolutely loved reading your book. It's chock full of really, really interesting, fascinating information. And your approach, of course, to culture creation is fantastic, which we want to talk about today. But before we get into all that, I read the first part of your book and as well as the rest of it as well. But what I want you to get into is I want you to talk about your background and why you're so fixated on culture and where this book actually came from.
Yeah. The purpose, if you like, my purpose in writing the book was to make fewer, if you like, mothers lose their children because of forced immigration. Now, there's nothing wrong with immigration. If people decide they want to pursue their life in another place, that's great. But I think there's a difference between choosing to leave your homeland and having to leave your homeland because of economic necessity. The values within the book are inherited, I think, from my mother. And a little story on that is, as a single mother in the late 50s, my mother was working for Johnson & Johnson in England. We'd had to leave Ireland because of some of the violent problems around Ireland at the time. And because my mother was a single mother, she worked through her lunch and she picked me up from school. And then shops in the late 50s, early 60s would close at 5 o'clock in Europe. They didn't have the flexibility that you'd be used to in the States. And I remember we arrived at a shop and the cleaners were already in the shop because it was about to shut. And I just happened to use the word cleaner. And my mother just said to me, she said, "Darling," she said, "don't see the lady as a cleaner. See the lady as a woman who's doing a cleaning job at the moment. She may have more than one job. And the reason she's doing the job is to feed her children, like I go to work to make sure you're okay." And that message, I was 5 years old, I think, roughly. That stayed with me for life, not to see human beings, not to define them by anything, by their job, by their color of their skin, by their religion or anything, but to see them as unique individuals. And if you take that approach, it takes you a long way. Now, the book is talking through a 40-year journey of experimentation in how the best way to make that kind of approach to people work in a globally competitive type of environment where you have to produce profit and be successful in order to afford to do all the good things that people write about in books.
So, but you're focused on culture specifically, Frank. Why culture? I mean, of all the things that you could actually, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, what I found in corporate life, I mean, I started in Shell in oil and went Unilever and various sort of big corporates, was that I found that it was extremely frustrating trying to change cultures. We would make lots of progress and then the thing would slip back. And personally, I found that when I was promoted to another location, another division, or even to another company, when I look back, some of the progress we've made had slipped backwards. So it was too dependent on a small number of individual leaders and maybe their charisma or their whatever it is they did, but then they move on and then it falls back. So I said to myself, there must be a better way of doing this. So the thinking was that if you think about changing culture as pushing a big rock up a steep hill, instead of a small number of people pushing the rock up, other people watching, and then other people sitting on the rock, making it heavier,
right?
Other people pushing the rock further down. If we had a much greater coalition of people across the organization, all pushing it up the hill, and because shop floor employees, etc., they tend to stay longer in organizations, whereas leaders tend to move their career and move on. It'd be much more sustainable if we could create a culture that did not depend on senior leadership. So the ultimate vision is that you create a culture that's so strong and so owned by the workforce that changes in senior leadership don't affect it very much. Now, that's extremely difficult because senior leaders can undo a lot of good work very quickly. New senior leaders can change things quickly in the wrong direction. And that happens when they don't appreciate what's already been achieved and they want to put their own stamp on it, for example. Mm-hmm. So that was why I focused on culture change. And
Brilliant.
Initially, it was top down because that's the way we did things.
Right.
And then I realized that there's a better way of doing this.
Right. And so I completely align with your whole bottom up, and you're going wide and deep through employee commitment. And that can be created much more quickly as well and more sustainably. I really align with that. And I appreciate too that and especially when you notice that leadership does change. Increasingly, I'm seeing, Frank, and my guests, that more and more people are talking about the need to really fully mobilize everyone in the organization, not just the few leaders. There's just too much happening in the world too quickly, too much change to rely on and expect that a small cache of leaders can actually move the needle. We need everybody, as you say, pushing the boulder up the mountain. So I want to talk about your approach, your rapid mass engagement approach, RME approach. Can you say a little bit about that? Because I know it really rests on 3 prongs. Can you tell us about those and really kind of the gist of it?
Yeah. Well, the rapid is about the speed of the change. So conventional thinking is that culture change takes a long time. It takes years and years and years. And I was involved in elite sport. I wasn't good enough to make it as a professional soccer player, but I came close to making it. And I could see that at micro level, you could make a massive change in sport. And originally, naively, I thought we could just take what we had in sport, apply it to organizations, everything would be fine. But it doesn't work like that. So if you have sport, business, and say the military, for example, there's lots of lessons from all 3, but the Venn diagrams are not the same. There's some differences. And what organizations tend to do is they tend to assume that someone who's successful in sport is helpful running organizations or in the military or whatever. There are lessons to be learned, but they're not the same. So the rapid thing is about how quickly can you make the change. The mass means everyone in whatever system you're trying to change. So you don't leave anyone out. So everybody owns the change. So nobody can say afterwards, well, that was just the project team, or that was just the people in the experiment. Everybody has to, and that's facilitated. Everyone has to contribute and also make decisions, which that's very different. They're not just participants, they're making decisions. So they're exercising power that they didn't expect to have. And the engagement is differentiating from involvement. So simple way of looking at that is, if you have bacon and eggs for your breakfast, the chicken is involved, but the pig is deeply engaged, and so we
Committed.
more,
Yes.
yeah, the old one about commitment, yeah, but it's actually true. And how do you get people engaged? Well, you have to, in a sense, you have to create solution space for them to make decisions, not just go to management and request things,
Right.
which is a kind of dependency thing. It's like a child-parent relationship. So we've got to turn that into adult in transactional analysis sense. So the employees in rapid mass engagement, together with their senior team, actually make decisions together by consensus. They don't lobby government for changes. They don't lobby Congress, if you like. They're actually in Congress making decisions with them in the room. And that's the essence of the three. It's quick, everyone, and it has to get to people at more deeper emotional levels than you would normally associate with work.
I really have just one.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I'm no worries. I just have one technical response to what you just said there, and that is a resounding amen. Especially the bit about really, allowing and enticing each employee to be able to proactively make those decisions. Now, I know for some leaders, and you talk about this in your book too, that probably scares the living bejeebies out of them. Yeah, and that's when we get to that 5-letter word, trust, which we'll get to later. But I just really want to be able to first surface just how in many ways what you're talking about probably will sound radical to many, and yet it is so necessary.
Yes, and the interesting thing about it is there's a correlation between the degree to which leaders are prepared to be vulnerable,
yes,
in front of their workforce, and accept the way the system works. So more potential clients don't end up working with me than potential clients do. And that's because in order to do something like this, you have to be really prepared to expose yourself in a way to very public criticism, which is mediated by me, but is still strong in some cases, and be brave enough and humble enough to say, yes, I got that wrong. A senior leader in Coca-Cola, a guy called Richard Davis, was so shocked by the feedback from his own workforce that after a number of workshops, he came to every workshop, which great show of leadership, at the end, to hear the feedback, etc. Not to discuss, but just to listen and understand. But he actually apologized at the end of every workshop. He actually said, I am ashamed that this is what has been going on in my organization, and I apologize, and we're going to work together to fix it. So that level of humility and acceptance that mistakes have happened in the past is something leaders are afraid to make often because they think it will damage their career. They think it will be career limiting. But in terms of for employees, the first thing is that it surprises. So if the employee is skeptical, then they don't expect to hear leaders do that. It's not the way normally leaders work. So when they see leaders that open and that humble, it makes them curious. This is different. Something different's going on here. I didn't expect this. For those employees who are cynical, all their predictions of what was likely to happen are undermined by the authenticity of the process, and that reduces their influence on the workforce. So part of this is like, if you think about the Second World War, part of this is that we're dropping arms and intelligence into the resistance to fight the Nazis, if you want to look at it that way. So I work heavily on providing stories and anecdotes, ways that ordinary people can engage their peers to overcome skepticism and particularly cynicism. And then when I train the internal facilitators, I train them how to do that, how to create those stories and use those. If you think about how Hollywood works, how literature works, people are interested in stories. They're interested in things that move them emotionally. So if you can do that genuinely with authenticity, and obviously there's a skill in that, and you have to train the internal facilitators afterwards. But if you can get there, the culture is sustained through those internal facilitators and the leaders in the workforce.
And I align with everything that you're saying, and I could add to that. Although, let's grab our first break because I want to make sure we get as much out as we possibly can. Time for our break. I am Alise Cortez. We've been on the air with Frank Devine. He's the founder of Accelerated Improvement, which specializes in creating a high-performance continuous improvement culture from the bottom up. He's the author of Rapid Mass Engagement, Driving Continuous Improvement Through Employee Culture Creation. We've been talking a bit about where this book came from and why it's so important, who embraces it. After the break, we're going to get into some of the actual steps of system changes that he brings out in his culture in the book. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. Before we get back on the program, I do want to announce something that I'm very excited about. It is the launch of the Purpose and Joy Tour. This is a collaboration with Joyly, an organization that teaches mindful practices to build a happy, healthy, and resilient world, and my firm, Alise Cortez and Associates, that exists to awaken people to their passion and purpose and build leadership and cultures that support these efforts. Together, we're going to 33 cities across the United States, starting in Dallas in March, and finishing in Virginia Beach in October to find our tribe and build a community of people who seek to elevate their lives and businesses by cultivating meaning, purpose, and joy. You can find the list of cities and dates and planned events at gusto-now.com. So if you're just now joining the program today, my guest is Frank Devine. He is the author of Rapid Mass Engagement, Driving Continuous Improvement Through Employee Culture Creation. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. So I want to dive now deeper into your actual methodology here, Frank. But before we do that, I think it makes a lot of sense for us to be able to talk about your specific definition of employee engagement. It is the most complete and descriptive I think I've ever seen. So how's that for a little pressure to lay that right on you? But will you talk to us? There are 6 pieces to what you talk about in employee engagement. Will you give those to us?
Yeah. Well, the actual definition you're talking about there, Alise, is one that an employee at Boston Scientific working with me created. And I actually thought it was the best I've seen. You know, he'd gone through this process. He was doing a master's at university. His name is Paul Garvey. And he describes it he defines it in his words. So I wouldn't want to take credit for that.
Okay.
Yeah, well, he was describing what he had experienced going through rapid mass engagement. So do you want to just go through each of the 6 bits and then I'll
So first I'll just say for our listeners and viewers, and by the way, listeners and viewers, I really want to invite you into this conversation. If you are really listening to what Frank is saying, this is a tremendous invitation to completely elevate your leadership game and alter radically your organization. And yes, we know it's very hard work, but I really want to invite you into this space. It's incredibly gratifying and fulfilling. So imagine this definition of engagement, which Frank has in his book. It's the demonstration of high performance behaviors based on the collective emotional, psychological, mental, and physical resources of employees focused toward organizational goals. And so then, if you would first speak to the emotionally connected.
Yeah, so this is the point we made just before the break, that it's not enough to get to people logically. So you have to get to them at a much deeper level. So, for example, the individual who created that definition as part of his master's, I was one of the lecturers on the master's course. What really impacted him was part of the higher purpose that we created. I facilitated it, but they created it. Was about the west of Ireland and the effect of emigration after the famine. So what we talked about there was a future for our family and friends in the West, which is the part of Ireland that was most heavily depopulated. So when we were talking to the employees about this, they all had family histories of people going to the States, to Canada, to Australia, to the UK, or other relatives arriving dead in the famine ships. So that level of historical feeling about what happens when the society breaks down and there's not enough jobs, in that case caused by a natural disaster, that resonated with people in the area. So it touched them emotionally, connected them to what we were doing. So we weren't just economists talk about capitalism, about maximizing profit. I don't know anyone who's really thinks that any successful leader that talks about maximizing profit in terms of employee engagement. Profit is a necessity, a bit like red blood cells in order to live, but we don't live in order to produce red blood cells. So the employees want to know the purpose of why we're doing this. And when you can, with authenticity, talk about this is about preserving jobs, this is about creating jobs. So in that particular location, we added an extra factory, an extra 1,000 jobs during a period of about 5 years. Now, it's not just this process that did that. That takes tremendous leadership, takes, a lot of other things, but that's what happened. That was what correlated with. So that's what we mean by emotional connectedness. And there's a physical and a, if you like, psychological side to that, which comes later in the physical side, the work itself, working really hard to make it easy for people to be successful. So when you're talking about manual work, that's about, removing things that make people tired, things that have repetitive strain injuries, things that are boring, which therefore makes you more tired. And then the emotional thing is this sense of this work matters, we're doing something. And that last one, if you're working in a medical devices organization, that's relatively easy. You can see that if you make people's lives better with some sort of heart device so they can now walk and run, previously they couldn't breathe, it's relatively easy for people to see that that's a good thing. If you're working in the arms business and you're creating missiles, then it's harder for the employees to see that. But what's going on in the Ukraine demonstrates that without the arms business, a lot of people would now be dead in Ukraine, etc. So you can find purpose regardless of the sector in business. You just have to look for it more in a different way.
Yes, I completely agree. And of course, that's my jam too. So the meaning and purpose space is critical, but it's how we talk about it, right? It's presencing it so that people can understand it. It's in their language, they can access it. And you talk about that so beautifully in your book as well. I won't go on to the other ones because I want to make sure that I have you talk through the other ones, because I just want to make sure that we have time for these other questions. But let me just quickly read them for our listeners and viewers. So he really does detail the emotional connection, physical involvement, the participation in decision making, which he talked about before, being mentally absorbed, right, in the work, have a positive perception of the work, and behaviorally directed, really thinking about this notion of directing our behaviors toward incorporating humility and challenge and respect, future focus, all these kinds of accountability. And then high discretionary effort speaks to giving more to the work in terms of time, talent, and resourcefulness and thought. So if you think about how much you could activate in a human being, it's pretty incredible. So
can I just say something on that, Alise,
yeah,
that last one?
Yes.
What we often miss in business is that we're in a competition for discretionary effort. So an employee decides how much of their discretionary effort they voluntarily choose to give to their work. And that's in competition with their family, with their interests outside of work. So a nice example was in Bacardi Martini. And the general manager said to me one day about this female employee who had been promoted, I think, twice already within the first 6 months. And he said to me, she's in the same body, but she's not the same person.
I love how you said that in the book. Yes.
Yeah. Now I said to him, well, let's think about this. She was always the same person. Now she believes that what the organization is doing is meaningful for her and her values. So now you're seeing her at her best. By the way, she went on to be promoted more. And in terms of diversity, just slightly going to a tangent, the best diversity and inclusion thing you can ever do is make sure that every single person gets the opportunity to show their maximum discretionary effort. Otherwise, you don't know the talent you've got.
Right.
So the most tangible thing you can do for diversity is do this kind of thing. And management's always surprised. They say things like, I didn't think she had it in her. She always had it in her. You just didn't see it.
Right. You didn't know how to activate it, how to actually access it and mobilize it. Yes. And so one of the things I talk about in my work, Frank, is teaching everyone, especially the leaders, to go looking for what's special and unique about people, and then find a way to activate it, give them the spotlight, allow them, encourage them to shine. Yeah. So you and I are lock and step on this.
Building on that, the enablement bit that comes in later in the book, the twin of engagement. If you just work on engagement, and by the way, rapid mass engagement and enablement will be too long. So that's why it's not there. But it just be a bit of a mouthful. But there's a twin. Engagement has a twin, which is enablement. And without the enablement, the highly motivated, engaged workforce will simply get squashed up against restrictive policies. I used to be an HR director, but my own profession accidentally creates barriers. We won't recruit people unless they have a degree. We won't recruit people unless they do this. We won't. Right. All of these restrictive thinking. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of talent among people who are not academically intelligent, but are incredibly intelligent. So this kind of race to over academic, I'm not against university. I speak at universities, but it's not all. We're not. Businesses are not academic faculties. We're not there to produce research. We're there to make organizations more competitive so they beat the global competition. That's our job.
Mm-hmm. Two things for that really quick. And you and I could talk a long time, Frank. But first, I want to say to our listeners and viewers and what you just said there, I had Soren Kaplan on my radio show a few weeks ago, and he has a book out on experiential intelligence, talking about just that. It's not about the degrees. It's what have we learned in life that's unique that we can bring to the world, and how do we activate that? Perfect. Second thing is, I got your next version of this. So right now you're talking about RME. You could say RME squared. So right, engagement. Perfect. The square part is the.
Think of it.
Well, there you go. That's your little gift for coming on my show. RME squared, Frank. That's where you're going with next.
It's actually true, because the engagement and the enablement, it kind of leverage each other.
I know. That's why I thought it was so fun. Okay, well, let's just quickly, because I got we've got 4 minutes or so left on this part of this, but if you would quickly go through the 6 stages of you have the RME change system,
Yeah.
change a system and culture simultaneously, and you have 6 stages to do that. Could you just quickly walk us through those 6 stages for our listeners and viewers?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you have to create the kind of purpose why we're doing this, and that means in normal everyday language, the kind of language you talk to your friends when you at the weekend stuff rather than corporate speak.
Right.
Then you have to create a process which involves every single employee in the process. Like we said before, you have to, and the actual sequence can vary client to client, but it includes things like the approach itself has to be aligned in terms of the last part of the process is about systems alignment, but you also have to make sure that the management process that you're using for your leaders is the kind of one that aligns with what you're doing with your employees. So make sure everybody's involved, make sure the process itself is genuine, open, authentic, align everything. You've got to make sure that the 3 levers that you push are continuous improvement and leadership, as well as engagement and enablement. And then rounding the whole thing up, everything has got to be aligned. And what happens in effect is that as you develop the culture goes ahead of the process. So you actually create the culture before you formally start to create the culture. The very experience that the employees have at the beginning of the process when they're all engaged in the workforce starts to change the culture before you actually formally do it. So have I got time to just give one simple example?
If you can do it quickly, we got to keep moving. Yeah.
We were in a break in one of the RMEs. We'd only done about 8 workshops, and the canteen manager, and they weren't involved because they're not employees. She approached me and my co-facilitator and said, can I have a word with you? My staff have spoken to me about what you're doing in the workshops. So if you're a man of a certain age and a lady comes to you and says, I want to talk to you about what the staff have said, you immediately assume you've done something wrong.
Right.
You said something wrong. So I was, oh my God. And she said, kept a straight face. And she said, please, whatever you're doing in those workshops, keep doing it. So I call that the bow wave effect. So the effect of engaging the workforce and even discussing what we're going to do before we've actually done it had a direct effect on the way employees treated the people at the checkout in the restaurant. They were more polite. They put their cell phones away. They made eye contact. So the staff noticed this. They weren't even involved in the process, but they said, whatever that guy's doing in there, please keep doing it. Mm-hmm. So the process has stages to it, like you said, but the more emotional side is you're actually changing the culture by the way in which you run the initial workshop the first time. And that creates a little wave that goes ahead of you so that people are coming into the workshops less and less skeptical, less and less cynical, more curious. And when they're curious, they're much more open and receptive to what you're trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. And on that note, let's let our listeners and viewers think about that. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We're on the air with Frank Devine, who's the founder of Accelerated Improvement, which specializes in creating a high-performance continuous improvement culture from the bottom up. He is the author of Rapid Mass Engagement, Driving Continuous Improvement Through Employee Culture Creation. Stay with us. We'll be right back for more.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Welcome back to Working on Purpose. I mentioned in the first break that we were launching the Purpose and Joy Tour, and the latest two books that I wrote are actually on that tour. So one of them is called The Great Revitalization: How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business, which helps leaders to learn how to build elevating and high-performing cultures in leadership. The other latest book, these both came out in March of 2023, is called Coloring Life: How Loss Invites Us to Live More Vibrant Lives, which helps people navigating loss to transform into growth and vitality. You can find them both on Amazon. If you're just now joining the program today, my guest is Frank Devine. He's the author of Rapid Mass Engagement, Driving Continuous Improvement Through Employee Culture Creation. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. So one of the things you've already touched on, Frank, but I would love for you to say more, because I think it's really, in many ways, it's quite revolutionary, which I really appreciate, you have this phrase of, and you mentioned it before, but you haven't actually said this actual phrase yet, but it's your process, RME, is designed to maximize solution space. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. Well, if you think about the conversation just before the break, we were talking about it in a kind of emotional sense, but about the 6 stages. So the idea of the 6 stages is, first of all, and the solution space is, when the senior team gets together at the first stage, they will often want to make decisions. First stage, the diagnostic. When the senior team get together, they will want to make decisions. They will want to plan, because that's what we do in senior management. So what I have to do is say, well, hang on a minute. You don't need to plan that. This is what you need to plan, but you need to leave a hell of a lot of space for the employees to fill that gap. That's solution space. The more you plan, the more of that solution space you take up, the less ownership the employees have. So that means at the second stage of the process, where you've got the workshops, you maximize the amount of decision-making power, if you like, the employees have. So they decide in those workshops what are the main obstacles to stopping the higher purpose. They decide what are the key behavioral data on which we'll create the culture, and they also decide. They elect themselves who's going to go to the decision-making event, the consensus day, where we make the decisions. So, and in consensus day, stage 4 of the process, if you like, then the solution space is everything. So as long as it's within scope, within the original scope of what the organization is trying to do, everything's up for grabs. And the whole decision-making process is by consensus. So the leadership team is not allowed, or neither are their trade unions. The trade unions are not allowed, or the employees are not allowed to have an adjournment and go and talk on their own. Everybody is in a big circle. So in one of these, you imagine 100 people with 1,700 data points trying to reach consensus. It took 24 hours of contact time. But the amount of solution space there is always maximized. So when I'm facilitating it, I know the more important the decision that's made in the room, the greater the ownership and the greater the sustainability. And by that stage, the leaders get it as well. But it takes them a while to relax and say, well, actually, with this group of people, the best people in the organization, elected by their peers, the senior people with good facilitation, good data, we're going to produce a really good change plan here. Now, it might not be the one the senior team would have come up with. In fact, it won't be, but it's going to be really, really strong. And eventually, you then have to train the managers, train the facilitators, and create sustaining mechanisms to make the thing continue over the years.
Mm-hmm. It's so beautiful, Frank. So beautiful. Completely with you. And you said this before. At least you alluded to this before. But I really want to emphasize this point. And it came out in your book when you were talking about how you were speaking at a conference, and of course you got elected to speak right after lunch. And so the conference was on how to change culture.
Yes.
And so you opened your talk with cultures don't change.
Yes,
and
that's
really
deliberate.
Right. Yeah. And made people to sit there and think and kind of wrestle with it, et cetera. And then you went on to explain individuals change. And when enough individuals change their behavior in the same direction, we notice retrospectively that the culture has changed. That's exactly. So powerful.
Yeah. So the atom, if you like, or the change mechanism for culture change is the individual.
Yeah.
And that's what drives the approach to leadership. That's what drives the focus on managing overcommitment, on appreciation, on real coaching, not the conventional approach to coaching. That drives the approach to constructive feedback. So all of that, the leadership has to be created in such a way to manage a workforce that is highly active and suggestive and wants to make change. So you can't have corporate policies and things that, oh no, you can't do that. No. Let's not start with the machine says no. Let's start with, well, let's explore this, see whether it is possible mindset. Everything is possible, but the search for maximum solution space gets you to very interesting innovation and the creativity.
So, and along the way, this is another really great thing you talk about in your book, that which you did actually allude to somewhat earlier, but this really speaks to when we're in the thick of this stuff here. You're having conversations with the team about all these things that you're trying to mobilize people, et cetera. And you talk about this idea of justified senior skepticism in your book, which is so incredible. So you tell us why that's a good thing and how it can be leveraged, please.
Right. Actually, it's dangerous when at the stage one of the process is the diagnostic day for the senior leaders to decide, is rapid mass engagement for us? Is it the right approach for our business in our circumstance? And often the answer to that is no. And sometimes the answer is not quite. We need a slightly different approach. But in that conversation, it's actually dangerous when everybody thinks, great, let's go for rapid mass engagement, because that could imply what I might call superficial consensus.
Yes.
Superficial rather than deep. They haven't thought enough about it to realize what's at stake and how much of a challenge it is for individual leaders. Or it could mean they're simply following a powerful leader that's decided to go down this path. So either way, it's not good. So one of the examples I give in the book from one of them is the guy said to me, okay, consensus day. Let me think about this. We're going to have 100 people in a circle. So we're going to be outnumbered about 12 to 1, 10 to 1, or whatever it is. And we haven't got the power. We haven't got the power to decide anything. We have to convince it. That it's got to be by consensus. And we have no say on what the agenda is, because the only people in the process that don't put anything on the agenda are the senior leadership team. They create the scope, they create the process, but they don't put anything on the agenda. So the entire agenda is owned by the employees. And then we're committed to implement whatever comes out of that process. So you can imagine, he wasn't convinced at this point. But that was extremely healthy, because it led to a real adult conversation about risk, about how you mitigate risk, how the process works. So by the end of that vigorous intellectual process, he came out the other end as an absolute champion, far better than the person who says, oh, it worked here, it worked in Coca-Cola, it worked in Rolls-Royce, it worked here, Bacardi, it'll work in my organization. All I got to do is let Frank come in and talk to my workforce and everything will be wonderful. It's not like that. It's not like in the movies, and the senior guys have got a big role in it. So justified skepticism is actually healthy. I would imagine people listening to this think, a lot of them will think, that sounds too good to be true. And in life, things that sound too good to be true are usually too good to be true. So that's absolutely justified. But the intellectual exchange around that is recommended. And I have actually walked away from clients and said, look, I don't think you're ready. If they haven't engaged with the difficulties. Lovely example in Boston Scientific. They said to me, we have 3,002 employees, 200 employees on this site. The biggest you've ever done before is 650. Can you guarantee that this will work for will it scale from 650 to 3,200? And I said, no, I can't guarantee it. But what we can do is problem solve. What we need to do to maintain the momentum over a much greater number of people, so we have bigger groups, essentially. We run 3 workshops a day. We work 7 days a week. So we get there quicker. So we deal with momentum that way. And we just problem solve our way around it. But initially it was, can you guarantee? And you can't guarantee, because this is real people in real businesses talking about real stuff.
Yes. Okay, so we're coming to a close here. We have just a couple minutes, but we have to talk about this. So you say in your book, and I completely agree, you said earlier, engagement alone is not enough. The need
Yes.
for enablement, continuous improvement, and leadership capability are necessary. So can you
Yes.
speak a bit more to the enablement piece here?
Yeah. Well, the enablement piece is removing artificial obstacles that prevent the engagement of the workforce coming to fruition. So if you have restrictive ideas around, for just one example, with childcare in one particular place, to move from one area of the factory to the other, it wasn't in the interest of the local management, because they'd have to train the new employee. But if they move to a different part, the employees could reduce childcare costs. So we took it away from local management and said we were going to deal with it at macro level, and say the presumption was that we would find a job for somebody on a different shift pattern to enable them to reduce their child care. So when you think about policy that way, yes, in the short term, it is awkward to train people when they move from one shift pattern to another. Of course it is in the short term, but in the long term, you're increasing the standard of living of the employee by reducing their childcare costs, by enabling them to work in a shift pattern that enables them to do that. So that kind of thinking, how do we make this work, rather than that's against the policy.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally get it. Okay, and then if you could just say just a little bit about continuous improvement as the second piece.
Yeah, there's a big scientific element in rapid mass engagement. So if you had unskilled, unknowledgeable approaches to how you improve systems, if you don't understand Lean, Six Sigma, whatever way you want to call it, and you just try and do this, you're going to severely suboptimize. If you don't have a leadership process which is designed scientifically to drive moving the dial, ensuring you're more efficient, the productivity goes up, the absenteeism goes down, the quality is higher. It's serious stuff. It's not happiness. So what you're looking for there is scientific methods about handling data, handling analysis, handling diagnosis, so that you actually make improvements that move the organization forward. So you don't work on symptoms rather than root cause. So you're spending time just dealing with symptoms. You are skilled enough and capable enough to make changes that will actually change the process of the business and make it continuously improving process so that it's competitive. So you need the leadership, you need the continuous improvement, you need the enablement, as well as the engagement. And the ideal is that you pull all those levers at the same time, and you don't have disjointed initiatives. So the continuous improvements run by whatever the function is, the leadership's run by HR, the engagement's run by somebody else, and they're all talking in different language. The employees notice that the idea is everything is aligned and comes in at the top, rather than being disaggregated, if you like.
Frank, there's so much more we could talk about. I have to have you back on at some point, because I love what you're doing and the way you explain. In say about 20 minutes.
I'd love to go on that tour with you, Alise. I'd love to.
I'd love to have you along for that ride. And say in about 15 seconds, what would you like to leave our listeners and viewers with?
Well, I think the key thing for people is things that people say are impossible are not impossible. If you have the right leadership, you know what you're doing, you know how to handle data, you know how to do the psychology, you understand the neuroscience, you open it up to people of all sorts of backgrounds, regardless of their educational level, you will achieve great things, and you will save jobs in the West, you'll create jobs, you'll contribute to communities, and you will change people's lives.
Beautiful, Frank. We are lockstep on this. I'm so happy to know you. Thank you so much for being on Working on Purpose. And you can run from me, but you can't hide. I will keep up with you.
Have a great time on the tour.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. Listeners and viewers, if you want to learn more about this remarkable man, Frank Devine, his book, Rapid Mass Engagement, and the work he and his team are doing at Accelerated Improvement, do visit acceleratedimprovement.co.uk. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch it via recorded podcast. We were on the air with Alton Mills, this time talking about his book, Be Unstoppable, the 8 Essential Actions to Succeed at Anything. Next week, we'll be on the air with Dustin Steger, talking about his book called Blame the Book, Rescue Your Workplace Culture from Toxicity and Scapegoating. We will talk about the power of culture, kindness, and taking responsibility. See you there. Remember that work is an integral and important part of our lives and can be one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune in to Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Alise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.